So this is not a picture, this particular shell is not meant to represent some kind of primeval microphone. Rather, I just got back 48 hours ago from Jamaica on a business trip, I may add. And this happened to be the most popular image that I shared on Instagram. And I'll actually get back to this image a little bit later in my talk because it's quite relevant to what I'm doing now. But it also is contextual because it's based on what I do in my day job. I'm the director of a graduate program at the University of Washington in communication. And we're in this incredible time of disruption where it's become so easy to communicate that we've got to figure out how to actually make those meaningful connections through the chaos and digital noise that we all have today. And so ultimately what I tell my students and what I tell my clients too, because I do a lot of consulting, is that we have to find ways to provide utility and relevance in everything that we use to connect to people. And that's what I hope to do this evening. I'm going to talk incessantly about myself tonight. But what I hope is to also give you something that's useful and relevant that you can take away in your own lives. I tell you a bit about myself. And just so we're clear here, I didn't throw together this talk over the last 2 days because I just got back from Jamaica. This was my original title slide. A little more generic, a little clearer, but the previous one, using a picture that I took, I feel is a little bit more contextual. And this is a lot about context. In fact, I'll give you a bit more context about myself. I was born in 1969 when the Beatles, my favorite group, were still together. In fact, I was born in London to parents who had emigrated from the Caribbean, not too far away from Jamaica, and they were going to study in London, and so I was born there. And so you could say that I actually heard the Beatles in the womb, and I was born when they were still together. And just a few years later, I was at a garage sale, and I was living in Toronto, Canada at that time. And I was a young kid, and I saw this particular record at a garage sale, and I said, I'm going to buy that. So I bought it for 50 cents. And my love affair with the Beatles began, and it hasn't ended since. In fact, a few weeks after I bought that album, the man who founded the Beatles, John Lennon, was actually murdered on the streets of New York. A few years later, when I was an adult, I had actually lived not too far away from that point, and I would walk by that apartment building every day on my way to work. So you could say that I've had this fixation on the Beatles, not only because they made great music, but because I actually wanted to be a Beatle. I wanted to have the same amazing social and cultural impact that they had. They, in fact, defined an entire decade. And so this ambition of mine that I've had since I was a kid has actually haunted me ever since, especially in my professional life. So given my fixation on England, because I was born there and I like the Beatles, I also have a fixation with The Economist magazine. I've been reading this particular magazine since I was 18 from cover to cover, because I figured if I wanted to be as great and as big as a Beatle, if I wasn't going to be an amazing musician, I had to at least be smart enough. And so I read The Economist, and this is actually a very recent issue where the writers essentially have proclaimed that we are in a very disruptive transition in our global economy, that we're moving away from this big business idea of institutions and industrial age that we've seen in the 20th century, and now it's a more sort of chaotic 21st century focus on entrepreneurialism and freelancers. And I just want to share with you a key passage from this particular article because I think it lays an intellectual foundation for what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. And here it is. I'm going to read it to you. Just going to. So in the on-demand economy, people will have to master multiple skills if they are to survive in such a world and keep those skills up to date. Professional sorts, that's how they speak in England, in big service firms will have to take more responsibility for educating themselves. People will also have to learn how to sell themselves through personal networking and social media, or if they are really ambitious, turning themselves into brands. In a more fluid world, everybody will need to learn how to manage You Inc. And so this is pretty profound, especially because I advise a lot of my students in my program about how to think differently and manage yourself in this new economy. And I realize that I've been doing a lot of this even as not a millennial. I know a lot of you here tonight are millennials, but I'm a Gen Xer. That I have been engaged in a certain form of self-disruption and maybe sort of professional self-destruction on a regular basis all my adult life. In fact, I don't even call what I've done a career. It actually seems to be a series of profound stories and episodes. And that leads me to the topic of tonight, drop the mic. So a few months ago, a former student of mine came up to me. She now works at the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, and this was at an event, and I had been on the stage. She said, I've been speaking to a number of my colleagues about you, and it seems to us that you're really good at dropping the mic. And I had no idea what that meant. I'd never heard it before. And so I actually thought it was an insult. In fact, I'm sort of fixated on the 60s and 70s. Heck, this is my son, and I named him after Jimi Hendrix. And so this is where I'm coming from. She said, no. Dropping the mic is actually meant to be a compliment. It comes from comedy and from hip-hop, and it basically means that you've said something so profound that it's okay for you to leave. You can actually leave on a high note because people will keep thinking about it well after you're done. You've actually done all you can do. So as I considered this concept, this notion of dropping the mic, I saw a tangible example of it on social media very recently. So you may know who Emma Watson is. She played Hermione, I can never pronounce this, Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter films. And she recently gave a remarkable speech to the United Nations on gender equality. So somebody reached out to her on Twitter and said, my dad says I can't be an engineer because it's a male profession. What do I do to change this? So Emma Watson basically takes advantage of the wonderful creative constraint of 140 characters on Twitter and in 3 words essentially says, become an engineer. And somebody who's watching this exchange on Twitter says, drops mic. So you can sort of see what Emma Watson did there. I mean, she didn't actually use a mic on Twitter, but all she said to this woman or girl is that you should just become an engineer to prove your dad wrong. And she didn't have to say anything else. And so as I looked at that, I said, you know what? This notion of dropping the mic isn't such a bad thing after all. And I think I've actually been dropping the mic my entire career, not just on the stage and in classes, but everything that I've been doing. And that's a good thing. And so what I'm going to do for you in my attempt to provide some kind of utility and relevance to you this evening is to give you 5 lessons from my personal life of dropping the mic. So, you see this is a graphic with nice hair. So this is actually a picture of me in student council in high school many, many years ago. You didn't think photography would have been invented. And I had decided to run for vice president of our student council on a whim. I just sort of felt, you know what, I actually want to be in a leadership position. Now, I wasn't really well known in high school at that time, and a lot of my friends said, well, nobody knows who you are. Why are you going to run? But I felt really strongly that I wanted to take that leadership position. So I ran, and I won. And during the year that I served, I actually played the role of the president because the guy who had been elected in that position really wasn't up to the task. And by the time I was done that year, I felt like I had learned a lot, I had done well, and I was ready to drop the mic. Here's the problem. Just as I hadn't listened to people when they said I shouldn't run for VP, I began to listen to people who said, hey, you were so good as vice president, you should run for president. It wasn't in my heart, but my head was saying, no, you should run. Your ego is listening to these people. And so I ran, but I ran so inauthentically, and my speech, I had to really struggle to give my speech, and it was the worst drubbing in the history of student politics at that school at that time. I lost spectacularly. A really great early lesson for me that if I didn't do something that I was passionate and that was meaningful to me, regardless of what other people thought, and that's my first lesson, it wasn't going to work. And so I've actually used that to guide everything I've done since then. So fast forward a few years later, and I'm 20 years old, and I get early admission to law school in Canada. And by the time I'm 23, I have 3 law degrees, including one from the University of Paris. And I decided I'm not quite ready to go into professional work. And so just for fun, I applied to go to Columbia University to journalism school. And while I'm in journalism school, and I haven't quite decided if I'm going to pursue law or journalism when I'm done, NBC News finds out about me, because they're based in New York, and they say, hey, we really like the fact that you've got this really interesting background in law and you spent some time overseas, and we're in 3rd place right now. We need people that we can cultivate in our network who could be the next generation of leaders. Would you be interested in coming to work for us? And so I dropped the mic on law, and I went to work for NBC. I got the job offer before I graduated, which was really quite remarkable. And during the 3 years that I worked at NBC in New York, I moved very quickly through the ranks and was being very much groomed for leadership. So I became really good at this. So even though I had a passion for journalism and my heart was in it, you actually had to show something. I had to give that credibility, and that's the second lesson. Now here's the ridiculous thing that I did as an arrogant 20-something. I started to feel the tug on my heart again that says, I want to go back overseas. And so I basically gave an ultimatum to the management of NBC, and I said, if you don't send me overseas, I'm going to quit. And amazingly, they said, okay, Hanson Hosein or Hanson Hussein, we're going to send you to be the Middle East producer in the Jewish state of Israel. So it's kind of like a backhanded gift, right? And so this picture, because I'm speaking to pictures, this picture was taken a few days before I shipped out to Israel. And this is me in the anchor desk at NBC Nightly News at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And they take these pictures, because I'm looking very suave and debonair. They take these pictures so just in case you're overseas, you get killed or taken hostage, they can actually show a picture of you when they talk about you getting killed or taken hostage. All right, so I am now in the Middle East. I am living a life, of a third British icon, James Bond, girls, gadgets, and international intrigue. And I'm reading The Economist, so I can get really good at covering international news. I win awards, I get stock options from the company, but here's the problem. I'm going to all these international conflict zones in the region, and I'm coming across people who don't have as much baggage as I do. And what I mean by this was the late 1990s, and digital technology was just coming out with smaller cameras. And for us to travel at NBC to these international stories, it cost us $50,000 before we even got out the door, because it was producer, which was me, reporter, sound operator, and camera person. And so you had 4 people going to a story. When I started noticing that people my age were showing up by themselves with those little cameras, and this is before smartphones, and they were telling more personal stories. And I said to myself, I want to be them. And so NBC actually offered me a huge promotion. They said, we're going to make you our chief overseas producer, and we're going to move you to London, where you were born, finally, 3.5 years after living in Israel. And I said, I think I'm ready to drop the mic on this. How about I become your first digital backpack journalist? I'm going to be cheap. I can travel around the world. I'll have a satellite phone, a laptop, and a camera, and I can tell some really cool stories. And they said no. And so I quit, which is crazy. Drop the mic. How do you quit on the dream job that you got right out of school, right? Insane. But what I ended up doing, I moved to British Columbia. I put myself into sort of exile. And I married the girl of my dreams, who's from Seattle, and I actually began to learn the skills that I wanted to do this. And I really felt, and this is the third lesson, this notion of tapping into the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. I felt this technology was coming like a freight train, and the place where I was working didn't get it. And I didn't want to be the guy left behind. And so I wanted to tap this wave of momentum and take advantage of it. So here's the funny kicker to this particular lesson. 2 years after I left NBC, I get a call. They find me, and they said, hey, there's a war coming in Iraq, and we actually need people who can be embedded with the Pentagon and with various military units, but they can't take the full 4-person entourage. And the fact that you can actually do all this stuff yourself, well, would you be interested in signing on with us for 6 months as a freelancer, get it as a digital backpack journalist? So the thing that I'd quit about, they wanted me to come back and do, which told me that I had done a good thing in this third lesson, and actually following my heart and actually looking at where momentum was going in a very big picture way. So what did I end up doing? I took the contract. I actually covered the war in Iraq from various places. I was on air on MSNBC and CNBC 600 times in 6 months. In Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. And this is a picture of me, looking, again, suave and debonair. I don't know how I do it. On the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, which was the flagship of the war at the time. This is where they launched the initial sorties against Baghdad. And you might, if you can see the picture well enough, there's actually tin foil over the camera. And that's not because I had my lunch with me on the deck of the Abraham Lincoln. It's actually the radar was so powerful that I was to protect the camera and the digital signal from the interference from the radar. So I actually tapped into this, and I'd made the right call in doing that. But I realized that my time in television news was generally up. I actually didn't really like the style that they were doing things in, this whole notion of the voice of God and the very sort of pompous sometimes approach to how they told stories. And I wanted to tell stories that were more personal. So I had in my head this notion that small towns across the United States were getting into some kind of conflict with big corporate chains like Walmart and Starbucks. And so I said, what if we did a documentary that sort of told the story of this insurgency against those corporate chains? And we called it Independent America, the two-line search for Mom and Pop. I would take my wife, Heather, with me, who's here tonight, and our dog, Miles. And I was going to emulate John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, and we would travel around the country. Here's the problem. We couldn't get any funding from a traditional broadcaster. And so this is 2005, and I said, well, let's show that this technology allows us to be brands in ourselves, and that we could do this ourselves. So I started sharing the idea very liberally with people. And we found a collaborator and partner in Toronto who would actually give us money to start doing this. And then we started connecting to towns. Towns started to invite us to say, hey, come look at what problems we're having with Walmart here. And so this is lesson number 4, that in this new age, this time of disruption, you can't be the lone genius. That's just a myth. You actually have to connect to people who might be initially your competitors, but can enable and collaborate with you to bring your dream and idea to fruition. And we'd made this film. It ended up I edited it in my living room for 2 months, and it was broadcast around the world, and it still streams on Hulu. And so we got a lot of play out of something that we really thought was worth pursuing. Oh boy, running out of time. 5th lesson, last lesson. After doing all this, the University of Washington offered me a job out of the blue and said, hey, we have this small, low-profile digital media master's program. Why don't you bring all these drop-the-mic experiences that you've had in messing around with this technology and see what you can do? So I redefined the graduate program by actually using all these episodes from my professional life. And here's what's great about this. Unlike NBC, which really owned me, I actually was able to do something on my own terms, but also still have the credibility of a massive institution behind me, so I could scale up a little bit more. So that's the 5th lesson, that you should actually use big institutions when you can to basically get your idea to scale. And this is a picture of me with Jeff Bezos, who's the founder of Amazon. I actually have my own television show on UW-TV, and because of my relationship and the credibility the university gives me, I can connect to global influencers like Jeff Bezos. So I told you that this comes from the Beatles. In fact, I actually, as I looked at the Beatles' career, those are the way I came up with those 5 lessons, and I applied it to myself. And I just want to recap these 5 lessons as applied to the Beatles, just to give you a better sense of how this works. So first of all, the Beatles were passionate about something. They loved rock and roll. And at the time, rock and roll was actually in decline in the late 50s. Elvis Presley was in the army, and so when they said that we want to do rock, nobody was really listening to them because they were actually not part of those times. Secondly, they were dedicated to craft. They had a chance to go to Germany when they weren't well known and play a huge amount of shows in a short period of time. A recent biography said they spent 918 hours playing in 27 weeks. Today, that would be the equivalent of playing 612 full shows, like something a band would do over 3 or 4 years. So they got really good really fast. Next, they tapped into the zeitgeist. They were there at the beginning of the 60s, John F. Kennedy being assassinated. There was social and political turmoil, and they adapted to that decade just as much as they helped define it. So they were part of the spirit of that times. Next, and fourth, they found a manager and a producer who could convert their raw talent into something that other people would be interested in. They couldn't do it on their own. And finally, they leveraged the machine. And at that time, that was mass media communication. The long-playing record was still fairly new. FM radio was playing full records. And television had just gone live with satellite television around the world. And they leveraged all of that to become who they were. But they eventually dropped the mic in 1970. And so I want to leave you with this and think about, well, how do you know when it's time to drop the mic? After you've actually followed these 5 lessons and succeeded in this chaotic, disruptive time, what do you do? And the Beatles broke up in 1970, much to everybody's chagrin, but they knew their story was over. They had done all they could do as a collaborative group, and they knew it was time to move on. So this is the most text you're going to see tonight from me. But you can just think about this and maybe even do your own self-assessment in whatever situation you're in now, whether you're at the beginning of your professional life or in the middle. When you know it's time to drop the mic, when something new is tugging at your attention and just won't let go, when you actually feel frustration at something that you once gave you joy, when everything else feels routine and you're no longer hungry, and you really want to learn again, and this means a lot to me as an educator, and when you want to be back in that groove when it no longer feels like work. So the big question is, obviously, am I going to drop the mic again? Well, my daughter, Rose, who's 6, recently said that she wants her family to help save the oceans. And back to that conch shell image from Jamaica. Well, the reason I was in Jamaica because I started a new company with a bunch of amazing collaborators called Prosperity of the Commons International. And we're actually leveraging all these technologies that I've dropped the mic with and on over the last 10 years to say there is now a new way to create sustainable economies for emerging countries so that they can actually hold ownership of their common goods, such as fish, water, timber, and they can actually have that within the community ownership and not give it away to corporations and not have it messed up by big government. And so this is something that we're experimenting with. There's no guarantee this is going to work, but that's the whole point of dropping the mic during an age of disruption, and I'm determined to do it. So I am never going to get hired to be the vice president of marketing at Microsoft. I'm never going to anchor the 6 o'clock news, but I am going to have a film that gets bought by Qantas Airlines and played in first class, and I am going to speak at TEDx Oregon State. And you guys, you may know this, have just been declared to be the 4th most innovative technology hub in the country, above Seattle, which annoys me just a little bit, but I think it's really great. And so all I can leave you with is I exhort you to listen to the Beatles, read The Economist, and make sure you drop the mic. You almost have an obligation to do this, because if you don't drop the mic, somebody just might drop the mic on you. Thanks very much, and have a great evening.